Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. I put out the video on all of the daily news for today, and then Grinding Gear Games came along and dropped a massive info dump on us. I was going to put out one video discussing all 12 of the Ascendancies. That was my first thought. Then I realized that's not going to be the way to do it, because there's one thing in here that's going to be the most talked about of all of the Ascendancies. One of these Ascendancies, and this is surprisingly the Warbringer. This is not an Ascendancy that I've seen a lot of hype for so far. In fact, it's an Ascendancy that does something fairly interesting, but the people aren't really talking about much because other things just do more exciting power fantasies than just the warrior that goes around breaking the enemy's armor and then using that in order to deal a bunch of extra damage. However, I wanted to really call out something very important here, and that is imploding impacts is going to break the game if the armor formula in Path of Exile 2 is the same as the one in Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 1, there's an armor formula that's quite complicated. It's designed in such a way that there's an asymptotic fall off as you get more and more armor, but the amount of armor that you've got is compared to the amount of damage the enemy attack does, and the more damage that the attack does, the less armor that you've got, the closer to just your armor doing nothing you become. The more armor that you get, the closer that the enemy's attack becomes to dealing only 10% of the intended amount of damage it was going to do. However, this formula that they use breaks in a ridiculous and hilarious way when you throw in negative numbers into the amount of armor that you've got. I'm going to put up some details from a spreadsheet on the screen at the moment. So let's start out with some of the more sensible results. Let's start out with an attack that deals 1,000 physical damage against a monster that has 0 armor on it. Guess what? You deal 1,000 damage to that monster. Who would have guessed? What if we give the monster 100 armor? Now, damage is nerfed to about 980. We give it 1,000 armor, damage is nerfed to about 833. We give it 2,500 armor, damage is nerfed to 666. 5,000 armor, we're talking now 500 damage, exactly 1/2 of base. Let's try 10,000 armor. Oh, now we've got exactly 1/3 of base armor. 25,000 armor, exactly 1/6 of the amount of base damage you would have done, 166. This continues growing until you hit 45,000 armor, which is 45 times the amount of raw damage that's dealt, at which point the net damage that comes through is 100. This is actually the limit. You can't go any further than this. Okay, so that's the way things work when you have a sensible, positive amount of armor, or at least non-negative. What about if we go with something just slightly less than 0? So we put in negative 100 into the formula for the amount of armor that the monster has, and we get 1,020 damage. Yep, that seems pretty normal. There's nothing unusual. This is just the same pattern you had, just continuing a little bit. Let's continue it a bit further, shall we? Minus 1,000 armor, 1,250 damage. Minus 2,000 armor. Now we're up to 1,666.667 damage. Things seem still to be making sense. It's just the more negative armor you can give the monster, the more damage you're dealing. What if we plug in negative 3,000 into the formula? At this point, 2,500 armor. Wow, that's really gotten more powerful quickly, hasn't it? But nothing's really broken the game yet. So let's try negative 5,001. Now I am cheating a bit here. Negative 5,001 is a number I chose very carefully here in order to break this formula as much as possible. But the amount of damage that we do is now negative 5 million. We have somehow flipped over. Not only have we gone from dealing so much damage that it's off the charts, but we've even flipped around to be so much damage that we're dealing a negative amount of damage. This doesn't seem to make any sense. It's all because of the asymptotic nature of this formula. Anyways, there is a sweet spot, and that is to get the monster's armor as close to negative 5,000 as you can without going over it. So let's try negative 4,999, shall we? What do we get here? 5 million damage. What about if we go negative 4,999.999999? At this point, we get 5 trillion damage. This is the ridiculous nature of an asymptotic formula. Now, I do think it's important to note, there is no guarantee that this formula will be what gets to live servers, and if it does get on live servers, it's probably not going to stay there very long. It's going to be a pretty miserable play experience to have a situation where you break a monster's armor so much that you end up causing it to wrap around. You miss these huge numbers that might actually outright one-shot the monster, and then you put the monster into a territory where any physical damage that you do to it heals it for a massive amount for a period. That's going to be a pretty miserable play experience, especially because that might also cause their armor to become unbroken completely, and so suddenly they come to have multiple millions of armor as well as having all their hit points filled up. It's going to be a pretty miserable play experience if it goes live, but it will be hilariously funny. This is the sort of bug that early access could potentially come up with. Of course, Grinding Games could have already built in a safeguard. They already have a minimum of 10% of damage that always punches through armor no matter how much you've got. If you hit a monster for 100 damage and that monster has a quadrillion armor, you're still going to deal 10 damage to it. It's kind of like the 90% hard cap on resistances that players can get. So there could be something like that in reverse, where perhaps there's a hard cap of 200% baseline damage, perhaps 150%. But if that's not there, this is going to be one of the funniest things that's going to happen in the earlier days of early access. I'm going to leave it there. We'll discuss all of the rest of the Ascendancies in detail over the next day or two. May your Varlords have interesting results.